Welcome to this week's 2-Minute Warning Interview, a series where we focus on addressing critical questions around the energy transition in order to achieve broader sustainability goals in the Middle East and worldwide. So we welcome experts and leaders from the region to discuss different pathways and recommendations to achieve net zero targets that are mostly set around 2050, 2060 for many countries. And today I am delighted to be joined by Ms. Olivia Azadegan, Energy Transition Director for Europe, Middle East, and North Africa at the Clean Air Task Force. So Olivia, thank you so much for joining the show.
Great, thanks so much, Layla, and thank you for the introduction. I'll just briefly introduce the Clean Air Task Force.
Go ahead.
So we are an environmental organization, science-based, whose mission is to decarbonize the global energy system, to address climate change and push the technologies and policies that are needed at a governmental and decision maker level so that we can achieve a zero emissions, high energy planet at an affordable cost. We look to build momentum for solutions based off scientific evidence, intellectual integrity, and pragmatism. And we're working to meet the world's rising energy demand in a way that is financially, socially, and environmentally sustainable. We are pushing optionality. We are pushing policies that incorporate the various countries' regional considerations and the policies and technology levers that will be needed to achieve this.
Yeah, and amazing. And we're so happy to have you on the show and kind of to bring that and the work that you do in the broader energy transition journey that every country, every individual, every stakeholder today is on. Everyone talks about sustainability and the urgency is here and we need to act now. I wanted to get your initial thoughts on the state of the energy transition, more specifically in the Middle East and North Africa. Obviously, we have major stakeholders, specifically, for example, national oil companies that have a huge say and kind of the direction that we're going to go. So I wanted to get your initial thoughts on the state that we're currently at and maybe initial steps that can be taken to accelerate that energy transition. Obviously, considering also the recent events in Ukraine and Russia, how can we balance that energy security versus energy transition act?
So for us, there are three main themes that really come out of for the Middle East and North Africa and their potential in the energy transition. The first being that they can be a pioneer of how many fossil fuel dependent economies transform to a zero carbon economy. So in the Middle East and North Africa, there are a number of nations who are major producers of export of fossil fuels and exporting those fuels, which means that the region has a lot of strength as a decarbonized energy provider. So that will involve deploying essential climate technologies and climate solutions, which include things like fossil fuel transformation to alternatives such as low carbon hydrogen and ammonia, as well as enabling technologies and measures such as carbon management and methane controls. The importance of doing these is very well understood in energy transition literature and research. And the Middle East and North Africa region can demonstrate its climate leadership by moving towards the large-scale production of these measures and these enabling technologies. A second theme that's very important is the commercialization of these technologies. We mentioned hydrogen, and that is expected to account for the third highest share of abatement after electrification. And we're already seeing a growing global market for low-carbon hydrogen. And this presents a massive opportunity for the fossil fuel exporters in the region to take advantage of scaling hydrogen and the enabling technologies and measures to build decarbonized energy export markets. The International Energy Agency, for example, is projecting that there could be an almost five-fold increase in global hydrogen demand from today's levels by 2050. And this presents a huge opportunity for regional actors. Yeah. And the third theme is what you talked about is the fostering of clean energy security for Europe, as well as other export players. Both Europe and Asia are going to need imports of clean energy to deliver on their net zero targets. And since the Middle East and North Africa has some of the main producers of fuels, they can help support those importing players with their energy needs. We had a recent report, How the Middle East and North Africa Can Accelerate the Global Energy Transition. And this looked at how these fossil fuel exporters in the region can create zero carbon fuels markets, scale up that supply, and drive the transition from a policy standpoint.
That's you mentioned the point of technologies, and obviously it's such an important aspect of the energy transition and is an initial driver of that. What progress in terms of digital technologies? So for example, AI, Internet of Things, all of those huge tech and digitalization tools that can be implemented, do you see that the acceleration is there? Or do you think that what aspects of it do you think can be pushed to accelerate that transition? So apart from hydrogen and obviously the renewables and all of those techs, the implementation of digital tools, whether it's at the national oil company levels, whether it's within stakeholders, is it there? Are we accelerating, or do we need to ramp up the acceleration behind that?
Yeah, so digital tools are going to be useful in terms of measuring and in terms of looking at things like the greenhouse gas content and the CO2 associated. But it's not the first step. For us, the first step is really deploying the critical climate technologies that we need and having a commitment to that at a policy level, so that we can crowd in investment and so that we can signal that these markets are going to be there in the future. And then for us, that is what would come after the commitments and after the deployment of these technologies. These markets have not yet been built. These are projected future hydrogen needs. These are targets that we have around how much CO2 we need to capture and store. So definitely all of these tools are going to be very important for the measuring and the monitoring of that. But for us, the first step is getting these on the table at a decision maker level and at a policy level.
And in terms of the different alternative fuels or different alternative renewable energy sources, we hear about solar, we hear about wind, we hear about hydrogen that you mentioned perfectly. In terms of those ones, do you see one of them kind of taking the lead in the Middle East? Obviously hydrogen, especially last year, has been like the main kind of keyword that has been in everyone's mouth. Do you see hydrogen taking the lead in the Middle East, and the Middle East taking the lead in implementing and developing hydrogen technologies? Or do you see also solar technologies or wind technologies also ramping up? Or is there a specific focus that we need to put on developing hydrogen technologies?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to first establish that there is no definitive pathway to decarbonization in terms of policies or technologies or otherwise. We need adaptive policy that responds to changing markets. And since we've never done this before, we should refrain from the belief that there's a silver bullet policy or technology that can deliver the comprehensive systems transformation that we need on our own. Now, that being said, the GCC does have the opportunity to help develop a global market for hydrogen, but we also need to remember that this will be just as international and interdependent as the existing fossil fuel paradigm. So partnership and international cooperation is going to be really key here. That being said, the GCC and other fossil fuel exporters in the region can pioneer the transition of the oil and gas sector and send major signals. MENA is in a good position to send those signals to the market, as they're a major producer of fossil fuels, so they can use that expertise to support the creation of a zero carbon fuels market by scaling their supply and creating the right policy and market conditions, but doing that through international cooperation. So things that would be very useful is moving away from the idea within this context that in parallel with the deployment of renewables, we also need to deploy renewables, but we also need to bring other zero carbon energy and climate technologies to the table, which includes things like carbon capture and storage, low carbon hydrogen, and permanent carbon dioxide removal, as well as upstream methane management. So with fuels, we'll always be talking about a global market that's very international. So there is an opportunity for the region to take advantage of, but it's going to be a partnerships challenge to get there.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the carbon capture and storage, and there are so many technologies, as you mentioned, that kind of need to be scaled up at the same time. I wanted to talk about the financing and investing in these technologies, which sometimes there's a gap in the financing of certain technologies. Investors need to be attracted. We need to create attractability and investability in some of these technologies. I mean, there are numbers on a global scale. Achieving net zero requires $125 trillion in climate investment by 2050, according to the UN recently. So in 2021, the world had spent around $755 billion on deploying low carbon energy technologies, which is up 27% from the year prior. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because there's so much more that needs to be done, and a lot of investment needs to be done by that. In your position, do you see these investments coming, or do you feel like there are different things that need to be done to attract investors worldwide?
Yeah, so cost effectiveness is one dimension we should consider, but it's not the only item we want policymakers to be considering. We're looking for a portfolio of policy options. So from a policy standpoint, we want the region to be investing in decarbonized energy options, and we're already seeing signaling on more ambitious hydrogen and ammonia fuels production targets, as well as the scale up of carbon capture and storage. But in order to really signal that, we need to see the deployment of climate innovation technologies at scale, so the region can be a leader on those technologies. And given that Gulf players are very long-standing energy partners for Europe and Asia, and now have the additional geopolitical and climate impulse to position themselves as reliable providers of clean energy, scaling up the production in line with the projected future global demand for low carbon fuels would be a very key opportunity, and send those market signals to the world. Developing zero carbon fuels projects and the enabling supply chain will then provide the greater granularity on what policies would be required to allow for the further expansion of those zero carbon fuels. But again, there is no silver bullet, and working on more of these projects, the more likely we're able to see a successful energy transition.
Yeah, in terms of policies, there are so many different aspects, and governments have obviously made major commitments, whether it was in the Paris Climate and ever since. But obviously, the world has gone through major crises, whether it was COVID-19, the Ukraine crisis today. In terms of policy, specifically in the Middle East, do you feel like there are enough policies and frameworks in place to be able to implement energy transition projects, or do you feel like those need to be ramped up? And obviously, in your position, I wanted to get your thoughts. Is there lessons that can be learned from different countries? Obviously, each country has a unique position, and each region is very unique to itself. But are there key takeaways that we can take from countries like France or Germany that have policies in place, EU frameworks, etc.? Or do you feel like it needs to be built from the ground up in countries like the Middle East and North Africa that have very specific climates and situations?
Yeah, so there are multiple ways that you can approach and implement an energy transition, and each country will need to do that based off their NDCs and other commitments. So the MENA region has expertise to develop and be a leader in climate technologies such as carbon capture and storage. And with the market pull from Asia, this is helpful to create the market demand for those zero carbon fuels within the Middle East and help establish that market. But there are multiple ways that we can approach it. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has a very interesting approach to driving that outcome with its circular carbon economy framework, which they're using to manage emissions, and also using the principle of optionality, which is going to be very important because, as I mentioned, there is no definitive pathway, and we need adaptive policy, and we need to enable comprehensive systems transformation. So that's going to require a portfolio of options, both in terms of technologies, both in terms of policies, and in terms of how those technologies are deployed in each region.
Yeah, and you mentioned countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, obviously, they have I'm interested in knowing your point of view on the role of national oil companies in such commitments, because obviously they're such major stakeholders. Where do you see their role in? Are they leading it? How much can they help and support governments? Obviously, they're major stakeholders. So where do you see the role of national oil companies in the energy transition, whether it's Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, major names in this field?
Yeah, so they're in a good position to be able to pioneer how to transition the oil and gas sector and send major positive signals by turning to supplying clean energy and exporting those products to market. And as major producers of fuels, they can support and lead creating a zero carbon fuels market and scaling the supply. But this needs to be done with the right policy and market conditions and through international cooperation for the importing players over the other side. So some key enablers of technologies and climate measures that could be implemented is scaling carbon management and the transport of CO2 and zero carbon fuels. But all of these need to be aligned with the exporting players. And we have seen some historic moves in the region and for the scaling up and production of hydrogen, but we need to go faster. And these one-off projects are fantastic, but we need to scale up and developing zero carbon fuels projects and enabling a full supply chain. But this can't be done unless it's in line with the exporting players as well.
Yeah, and the role of governments, obviously, and the connection between the public and private sector. Do you feel like there are enough partnerships and projects in the Middle East that are being implemented, or how can we scale up such collaborations? Because obviously the private sector also has a huge role to play, whether it's in the energy transition or broader sustainability goals. Where do you see that collaboration happening, and is there enough of that so far in the Middle East?
So partnerships are going to be incredibly important, but partnerships need to be taking place globally within a global context. As with fuels and with decarbonization, we're always talking about an integrated economy. And as mentioned, this market is going to be very international and interdependent, the same as the existing fossil fuel paradigm. So with markets in Europe and Asia now signaling the need for importing decarbonized energy, the actors in the region can play a leading role by supplying that to energy markets around the world. One thing that's very noteworthy is recently the EU's climate chief, Frans Timmermans, stated that Europe will never be capable of producing its own hydrogen in sufficient quantities. And this demonstrates really that there is this growing understanding that we need cross-border cooperation to speed up the transition to a zero carbon economy. That being said, we need to look towards inclusive climate action, where industry topics, regional considerations, and all net zero technologies are included in the discussions and factored into policy to enhance action. So globally, we need to see pathways that are made in partnership with the global partners, with public and private actors, so that we can have as integrated solutions as possible, so that we can scale these and have the best chance of fending off the worst effects of climate change.
Yeah, I wanted to also go back to the point on carbon capture and storage. You have a specific focus on that at the Clean Air Task Force. Some of the CCS technologies seem slow in upscaling, and some argue that there's a fear that demand will maybe not be there in the future. I wanted to get your thoughts and opinions on that, because maybe some of the investment isn't going towards CCS and going towards other technologies. Where do you see the future of CCS going towards, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa?
Yeah, so again, we need to ensure that we are not having a hierarchy of options in terms of technologies, policies, or otherwise. So we're looking at a toolkit so that each region, each industry can deploy the technology solution that is most applicable for their decarbonization needs and pathway.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, with CCS in the region has a has history with CCS. There's a number of carbon capture and storage projects across the region. So there's the technical expertise there to do that. And there's interest in the opportunity. And what is needed is developing CCS at a scale that is climately meaningful. So within that, we're seeing a wave of momentum across the region and across the world for CCS. And we're very excited about some of the announcements that the region has been making and some of the strong signals of political commitment to increasing carbon capture and storage technologies in the region. So at CATF, we're very excited about the opportunity for CCS, both in the region, but as well as globally. And from engaging with players here, there's substantial interest and appetite to engage. And there's a lot of excitement around using CCS as a technology, which is encouraging for us to see. But globally, we need to put more emphasis on CCS. It's often an overlooked technology within the global climate paradigm. And at CATF, we're very focused on bringing up to the international level some of these technologies so that they can receive sufficient climate and policy attention.
And we mentioned earlier this connection between public-private and how at a global scale we need to really increase and scale up partnerships. I wanted to get your thoughts on knowledge sharing. So we've been talking about technologies, CCS, for instance, hydrogen technologies, and promoting those. Do you see that there's enough knowledge sharing happening between countries, between stakeholders, and how do you think we can create maybe a more innovative culture, whether it's at the work environment or also in terms of negotiations? There are initiatives that have been happening. I noted here the Open Hydrogen Initiative, where there are discussions and knowledge sharing that happen on a global scale. But how effective are these initiatives, and how can we promote them and keep increasing them?
Yeah, and I think it's really about education and discussions and forums and international convening. And there's a number of forums where international dialogues are taking place. But we really need to be educating around the policy and the technology needs. We need to be discussing optionality. We need to be discussing associated risk. We need to build the case for adopting these technologies and demonstrating how these technologies fit into each country's climate goals. We need to have connection between supply and demand centers and build those robust climate dialogues. And we need to promote a more diversified pathway to decarbonization so that these technologies and policies and climate measures that are needed can happen on a level that's both global as well as local for their and can be tailored to their local context. So at CATF, we're very focused around building the case for these technologies globally. And there's a number of forums where this is taking place. And there's a number of alliances, both within Europe, within the US, and globally, that are allowing these conversations to take place.
I think you mentioned a critical aspect, which is education, and I can't help but thinking about the youth and the role of the youth in the energy transition, and how at the end of the day it's the future leaders of tomorrow, such as yourself. You were recently selected as Forbes 30 Under 30 for your role in accelerating the transition in the Middle East and Europe. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how important it is to have the youth at the table, whether it's in, like you said, major climate events. Obviously, we have COP27 it's knocking at our doors. We're all heading towards November, all excited for Sharm el-Sheikh and COP27 in Egypt. Where do you see the youth, the position of the youth in these talks? And do you think that there's enough youth in these conversations?
The youth are incredibly important to inject that vibrancy and continue to raise these issues and be vocal around these issues, but also to be pragmatic around these issues. And what are some of the pathways that have the best hope for scale, that are as economic as possible, consider the geopolitical dimensions, the economic realities of our world, and so that we can accelerate financing into these technologies. So for COP27 in Egypt, it's very exciting for Egypt to play a central role in charting some of the dimensions of the energy transition for the region. But yeah, with the youth, what I'm hoping for is that we can see an understanding of some of the what are some of the pragmatic solutions that need to come to the table. Also embracing the fact that there's not one size fits all for a country, for a region, for an industry, and decarbonizing the energy system is going to be taking the energy system sector by sector, piece by piece, and looking at what needs to happen to decarbonize. Having the youth at these climate talks is so critically important to bring in that fresh perspective and to also continue to ensure that this stays at the forefront of the agenda. And yes, with the next COP, very excited to see as many youth participants as possible.
Yeah, we're unfortunately going to have to start wrapping up, but I wanted to get your point on this balancing act also between developed versus developing countries. So obviously at COP27, that's going to be a major topic. How do you think that countries can really still take that into consideration, taking into consideration the different positions and how every country is, like you said, at a different point of their energy transition? So how can countries and leaders from the developed countries, for example, support and assist countries from the developing nations that might have a tougher time, obviously, in terms of even being impacted by climate change, etc. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and if there are specific policies and specific work that you guys are doing where we can promote that and make sure that that's going to be a solid feature at COP27 and then obviously COP28 in the UAE.
Yeah, definitely. So for Clean Air Task Force, we're very excited that the next COP has the opportunity to center the developing world in the negotiations, and the discussions can reflect the reality that global energy demand will increase to enable a modern, just and fully decarbonized global economy. And for the energy transition in MENA, there's the opportunity for Egypt to play a central role in vocalizing that need and the necessary technology and policy pathways that will enable that, which will need to include the regional considerations, the all net zero technologies on the table and discussed and factored into policy action. And the Middle East, North Africa region and the Egyptian COP has a central role to play in elevating this discussion and how it can support with the decarbonization of those players. This will require the building of new infrastructure and scaling of zero carbon energy sources so that we can have a high energy planet at an affordable cost that is also kinder to the planet and does not have the emissions associated with that energy.
Yeah, and I wanted to get your final thoughts. I love closing out these interviews with kind of top priorities. So in your role at Clean Air Task Force, what would be ahead of COP27? And like you said, it's so exciting that it's taking place in the Middle East and it's such a huge opportunity. Where do you see the top priorities? If you had to list like 3 main things, I know you guys focus on policies and driving technologies and promoting those. Where would you see 3 top priorities if you had to sit at the table and be like, this is what we need to focus on? What would be kind of your main focus points?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I think for us, there are 3 opportunities for COP27 in Egypt for a more productive COP. The number one being what we just touched on, center the developing world and reflect the reality that global energy demand for these countries must be enabled so that they can have a modern, just and fully decarbonized economy. The second one is the same theme we've touched on, embracing optionality. We need to build a broad portfolio of technically viable zero carbon technologies and take a diverse approach to address the unique decarbonization profiles of regions, economies, whilst reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Since each region will have a different technology pathway, we need to commercialize all options with pollution control measures that include a focus on CO2 and methane management. And finally, the third would be breaking down binaries. We'd like the climate action dialogues to adopt cooperative, cross-regional, cross-sectoral approaches that recognizes the role of all stakeholders, with activists, environmentalists, governments, industry, all working together to advance these real solutions. At the end of the day, we need the know-how, we need the access to resources, we need the financial capacity, and we need to build infrastructure. And those would be the three things that Clean Air Task Force will be looking at the next COP.
That's amazing. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up this feature interview for today. But thank you so much, Olivia, for joining us. Thank you for being a part of the show and for sharing your insights with us. Do not hesitate to follow Olivia and the Clean Air Task Force to see how we can all accelerate and all jump on that wagon towards net zero goals. And you can also follow us at Gulf Intelligence to listen to our weekly 2-minute warning interviews. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Olivia, for joining this show.
Thank you so much.